some participants were not able to join us, but still wanted access to the video. And at the end of today's session, you all will have access to these slides. I always tell people I am not a gatekeeper of this information. I want adults, I want all of us that work and support youth to make sure that we have this information. So you will all have access to these slides. Today, we're going to talk about and really learn how trauma does impact the brains of youth. So what does that look like during brain development? We're going to understand how trauma shows up, essentially kind of how it manifests in our brain and our body when we experience trauma, and then reflect on trauma-informed approaches based on the work that we do. We will first be talking about trauma in the brain because it's really important for us to understand, especially working with youth, how trauma does impact the brain development. So we're going to kind of do a deep dive into that today. And then we'll go into those components of trauma-informed care. What does this actually mean for us? I'm a huge advocate in relationships. I'm a firm believer that relationships are the beginning of decreasing and supporting youth who are impacted by trauma. And so we're going to talk about the reason for that, and then look at the actual responsive practices of how we're supporting our kiddos in the space that we're working with. So we'll look at our environment, the routines, the procedures, the organization of our work. We're going to talk about some behavioral expectations as well as positive reinforcements. So to begin, like I said earlier, we really are going to start with understanding how to support youth exposed to chronic stress, exposed to trauma. And to make sure we are all on the same page about this, when I use the term trauma, I'm really specifically talking about a response to a negative external event or a series of events which surpasses a child's ordinary coping skills. It comes in many forms, and some of these forms include experiences such as maltreatment, witnessing violence, the loss of a loved one. Traumatic experiences, as we know, can impact brain development, and it can also impact the behavior of the youth that we serve. About a quarter of children have been exposed to a traumatic event that can potentially affect their behavior, right? Potentially affect how we engage with them. Trauma can also impact memory, attention, cognition. And we also know that it can interfere with problem solving, which can often result in frustration with our kiddos and anxiety with our kiddos. We know that children who have experienced trauma may experience physical distress, may experience some type of emotional distress. And the good news, for lack of a better term, is that we as adults in these children's lives can help. We can support kiddos who have been experiencing trauma, are currently living in a traumatic situation, or have previously experienced trauma. When we have children that have experienced multiple traumas, their brains and their bodies actually start to function as though the threat remains, right? So a traumatic event happens, and they end up spending a lot of time in what we call their alarm reaction, which is their fight, flight, or freeze. They will spend time scanning the environment. They're literally looking for threats. Their bodies are staying in this constant state of alarm. This is one of the reasons why paying attention, recalling information, retaining ideas or retaining information becomes really difficult, because all of those, the way that our brain is developed and the way that our brain works is that these different types of engagement for our brain is done in the prefrontal cortex, right? It's done right in the front of our brain where all of that executive functioning happens. When we have a child that is in a constant state of fear, they are not utilizing their prefrontal cortex. They're living out of their survival brain, right? Because all they need to know is how to survive. Do they need to fight the threat? Do they need to run from the threat? Or do they need to freeze? This actually alters the neural systems in our brain. And I'm going to talk about this and go into that a little bit deeper. And we know that especially with youth impacted by trauma, there is significant difficulty in building positive and trustworthy relationships with adults as well as with peers. Because in that alarm reaction, when we're worried about survival, we don't necessarily trust anybody, or we don't know who to trust. So this visual right here is a visual of our nucleus, right? And the neural pathways. And in the middle of this nucleus, what you're looking at is our neuron. And off of these neurons are dendrites. The dendrites are literally the wiring of our brain. And if you've seen any of my sessions previously, you know I'm obsessed. I'm a huge fan of talking about how culture impacts our brain and brain development, and it's very similar for trauma. The dendrites are why we engage in specific patterns of behavior, the thought patterns that we have. And you can see, like in the left-hand side of this slide, kind of the bottom left-hand corner, the more we engage in a thought pattern, the more that we engage in a behavior, the thicker that dendrites become. So this visual is literally showing us that our thoughts, our biases, our culture, and our trauma actually have a physical presence in our brain. The thinner the dendrites are, that means that it's slower communication in our brain, right? It's not a belief that's ingrained very deeply yet. It's not a pattern of belief, right? So this is maybe some new thoughts that we're having or new behaviors that are just being formed. The thicker dendrites happen through what we call myelination. And that means that the more that we engaged in a thought, the more that it starts to essentially form in our brain, showing us this physical pattern in our brain. When we have a youth that has been exposed to trauma repeatedly, they start to develop thought patterns around that trauma without even knowing it. It literally starts to take up a physical part of their brain. And so they start to develop belief patterns based on the trauma that they are experiencing. I work a lot in school districts, right? I work with a lot of students, a lot of teachers, a lot of adults. When I work with kindergartners who have already been suspended, and we're talking, it's November right now. Oh no, my gosh, it's December. Ugh, where did the year go? So yesterday, which was still November, observing a kindergartner who, as of November 30th, had already been suspended from school 5 times for their behavior. They are starting to develop that belief that their behavior, which, as we know, behavior is trying to get a need met for a kid or communication, means that they go home. And we're going to talk about this trauma cycle because sometimes what we know about trauma is that when schools send a kid home, they're sending them right back into potentially a traumatizing situation. What this visual shows is that at the very bottom of the tree, those are our thoughts, right? Those are those overdeveloped dendrites that we start to form. When we have an overdeveloped thought, that leads to a feeling. It leads to an emotional and physical response. If I start to generalize, right, my thought is, all of my teachers don't like me. I start to feel literally sick when I go into school because I am scared because I know that my teachers don't like me. Then our feelings lead to our behaviors. My behavior is I'm going to act out because I would rather get sent out of class for my own behavior than from the teacher not liking me, right? Or another example, I would rather be a class clown and make a fool of myself in front of my peers and get kicked out of class than have my peers know that I don't know how to do the work. And our brain becomes accustomed to this cycle. And when I say behaviors lead to results, that doesn't always mean good results. It also means consequences. So we have kiddos impacted by trauma that are living in this cycle and having a really hard time getting out of it because it's physically part of their brain. Now, what we know about the brain is that it never stops growing. It never stops changing. It never stops responding to interaction, to the environments. When a brain grows in a typically developing way, this happens through caring relationships. It happens when we are physically safe and emotionally safe, when we have a sense of belonging, and when we have opportunities for challenge, right? We have to push ourselves. Now, any of the youth that we work with, they learn skills and concepts in a different way at different times. And it's really important to recognize that positive, stable relationships can actually buffer the potentially negative effects of even really significant adversity. I'm going to explain that using this visual again of the neuron and the dendrites. When we have kids who are very impacted by trauma, so they have belief patterns that have been well developed through trauma, they may have a hard time trusting and building positive relationships with us as adults. So that means that it's our job to stay consistent with that relationship development so that we slowly start to build this really teeny tiny, skinny dendrite, and we start myelinating it in that kiddo's brain. So I guess we're technically not doing it, but their brain is doing it around their relationship about us. They slowly start to build a new behavior pattern. And our goal, the hope is that over time, this new belief pattern, the thoughts that they're having, that turn into feelings, that turn into behaviors, actually becomes thicker because of the relationship that we build with them. So it's going to become thicker over time based on our consistent relationship in their life. And I know I have a lot of guardian ad litems here tonight and youth advocates within the systems within the court system. And so this is one of those reasons why for any of you that support youth in the foster care system, it's so important that we stay in that kiddo's life through the court proceedings, that we are that consistent person, that we're checking in on them monthly, right? So we are actually building that relationship so they start to develop a belief about adults that we can be trusted, that we are a part of their life, that we are consistent, we are going to show up. When any of us and any youth are facing adversity, facing chronic stress or trauma, this does affect learning and brain development. The philosophies, our policies, and interventions that we employ within our work system make a difference. Emotions and social relationships do affect the learning and growth of our children. And when I say learning, I'm not only talking about, and I'm really not talking about just academics here, but I'm talking about the physical development of executive functioning in a child's brain. When this happens, the interest and excitement for learning increases, and self-doubt for our kiddos starts to decrease. Positive social and emotional skills that build on a foundation of empathy and a foundation of self-awareness contribute to relationships, to safe environments, to learning. And we also know that brain growth and development is increased with some type of hands-on learning, right? Some goal setting. So if you work with older kids, how do we set goals for them? How do we make those goals achievable, attainable, realistic? I started my career as a special education teacher for students with emotional and behavioral disabilities. And I started teaching in Seattle before moving on to work in Las Vegas and the school system in Clark County, Nevada. And I will tell you the amount of students I had who, let's say my 17-year-old students who still hadn't even gotten 9th grade credits yet, right? They had failed all of their classes since the 9th grade year. And they come into my classroom, and usually one of the first things I do is I do weeks worth of lessons on goal setting. And let's say 4 out of 10 kids, every single year, it never failed, wanted to be some type of professional athlete, right? That was their goal. And so I'd be like, awesome, tell me what basketball team you're on? Oh, well, I've never actually played basketball, right? And so then we start from there, because the truth is that wanting to be a professional NBA star at the age of 17, when you've never been on a basketball court, not super realistic for our kiddos, right? So let's start small. Let's start thinking about things that we can kind of chunk and manage for them to support the process of goal setting. Now I'm going to kind of dive in a little bit more on the impacts of trauma for our brain. We know that when children are impacted by trauma, there are structural changes in their brain. We actually see a reduction of volume in the hippocampus. And this is what's responsible for our learning and memory. In our cerebellum, balance, coordination, emotional control. How many of your kiddos have a hard time with emotional control? And the prefrontal cortex, those executive functioning skills. We know that some additional activity changes are those changes in our neural activity. The amygdala changes, assessing threats, right? If we are constantly living in a survival state of mind, we are assessing our threats significantly. Also, abnormal cortisol levels. We might have too low. We might have too high. And again, right, there's that prefrontal cortex again, executive skills, and that reduction of neural connectivity. So again, building in and myelinating those dendrites slows down through trauma. And then I'm sure for those of you that work with youth, you know that there are also some functional changes, which leads me to behavioral changes. I would say and I've worked with hundreds of kids over the years for behavioral challenges. Probably 95 to 99% of those kids have been impacted to a certain degree by trauma, right? They might experience a persistent fear response, hyperarousal, right? You open the door and they jump. They have a harder time with their working memory. They might be really impulsive. They might have an increase of risk-taking, have a hard time navigating social situations, and they might have a weakened response to positive feedback, which means if you give them positive feedback, they might respond as though they do not like that. They might act out, they might feel embarrassed, and it's because they're not used to it. And breaking this down a little bit more, and I'm not going to go over all of these, but again, you will have access to these slides. This is how childhood trauma can impact mental health, relationships, emotions, physical health. Earlier this week, again, I was observing a 5th grader really impacted by some pretty significant trauma going on. Every single class that he goes to, he tells the teacher that he has a really bad headache. And if the teacher does not let him go to the nurse, and by the way, the nurse is like his all-time best friend, he loves the nurse, he starts to act up in class. He starts to throw things at the teacher, right? He took another kid's paper and started tearing up the paper. He started cussing in the middle of class. Well, guess what? Now the kid got sent out of the classroom, right? So at first, physically, his experience was that he had a headache, right? That's why he wanted to be sent out of class, regardless of, and sometimes for kids impacted by trauma, they do have different, it manifests in different ways, and headaches or stomach aches are really common. And if in that moment they don't get what they want, like get sent to the nurse, they might engage in other behaviors that's inappropriate. Yeah, so I got a message that I will respond to. So somebody asked, do adults that experience trauma later in life also affect the size of brain and functioning in those areas? So if adults, and I have a slide that goes over this a little bit more, but if adults have experienced trauma later in life, I would say, so if an adult is a typically developing adult, all of these areas, because our brain is done developing by the age that we are about 25 to 27. And the last part of our brain to develop is that prefrontal cortex, that executive functioning skills. So if the trauma happened after all of that was done, then in terms of like size of brain, that is not going to be impacted, but there might be changes in neural activity, right? In terms of like our heightened fear, assessing our threats, the amygdala is really triggering. And there might also be some behavioral changes. The good news is that our brain is able to always change and adapt and grow. And so even if we experience trauma later in life, or even if we've experienced trauma for years as a child, there are ways through therapeutics resources, therapeutic supports that we can get our brain back to where it is supposed to be. But this is what it looks like, right? And so I will respond to this in 1 second from Angie. So this is why our brain development can be impacted by trauma. Because with typical development, we start, so in utero, the part of our brain that gets fully developed in a typical developing individual is survival, right? That's the first thing that gets developed. From there, we get regulation, right? You start with this through like the terrible twos and moving into, if you've ever had a 3-year-old, those 3 major stages, right? They start to figure out their own regulation. And then it moves into social and emotional. And this happens through puberty, specifically during those adolescent years. If you work with middle schoolers, you know what I am talking about when I say that oftentimes middle schoolers tend to see the world. So this 11, 12, 13-year-olds tend to see the world through an emotional lens. That's because that part of the brain is what is triggering or firing much more than any other part of the brain. And then the last part that gets developed is our cognition, right? And that's when it's fully developed by the age of 25 to 27. But it's a layering on approach. When there has been trauma during these developmental years, the survival part of our brain is what grows the most because they are living in that part of the brain. So it's consistently firing. And then as you can see, the least amount of the brain that is utilized is the cognition. And that's because they are not living in their executive functioning in their prefrontal cortex. And so I'm going to respond to Angie's question. You mentioned some youth may respond to positive attention by acting out, which likely indicates they are not used to positive feedback. How do you work on providing positive feedback for these youth? So the first thing I do is make sure it's private. So I won't do it out in front of other youth or in front of other individuals. Some kiddos, it means that I just do like a thumbs up, right? It's not verbal, it's visual. Right? For some kids, it might be a sticker chart. And so I'm just walking by them or I see them and I'm giving them a sticker, right? So you're doing it in ways that doesn't call attention to them, but you're still acknowledging that they are engaging appropriately. And this is what it looks like when these different parts of the brain are firing, right? So to the right side of the slide, like we talked about, this kind of peach-ish color is what we call the reptilian brain. This is that survival brain. Again, it's the first part of our brain to be developed. And that's the brain where if we are surprised, right? If we get scared, if we need to go into fight, flight, or freeze, that's the part of the brain that gets triggered. And there's another new F word. I don't know if you've all heard about it, but it's fawn. And fawn is, so it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Fawn's been most recently researched over the last 10 years or so. And so is now just becoming more apparent. And we're starting to talk about it more in terms of how youth respond when they are impacted by trauma. But fawn is when youth will do anything to please the person that is causing the trauma. So sometimes we see this in like kidnapping situations, right? Sometimes we see this if youth if youth know that if they please the person that is causing the trauma, then they won't experience as much trauma, right? So sometimes with physical or sexual assault, we see fawn as well. So this part of the brain should only be firing when we are experiencing some type of state of alarm. We then have the limbic system, and that's right in the middle of our brain. And the limbic system, like I said earlier, is responsible for our emotions. The limbic system becomes fully developed when we are just out of puberty, right? So puberty is when when the limbic system really starts to fire. And again, that's why many middle school students or middle school age youth tend to see the world more through that emotional lens, because that's what the limbic system holds. And then we have the neocortex, this big purple part of the brain on the outside. And what is in the neocortex is that prefrontal cortex. And like I said, in a typically developing brain, the prefrontal cortex is fully developed by the age 25 to 27. So on the left-hand side are different brain scans showing where emotions show up in the brain. So as you can see with anger, the individual, for the most part, and red is where that part of the brain is really firing, that individual is in the reptilian brain and somewhat in that limbic system. For sadness, you can see, again, that reptilian brain, and then a lot in that limbic system. For fear, it's all reptilian brain. And then for happiness, that's where you see the majority of youth in their executive functioning brain, in their prefrontal cortex. So when we are working with youth and when we are explaining information to them, and I'm talking to all of you advocates who have older youth that you work with, and you have to explain some of the court process or explain the documents that you're receiving. We want to make sure that our youth are feeling safe, feeling some type of sense of belonging or connectedness to us, so that they are living in that executive functioning brain. Because when they're living in fear, in that reptilian brain, they are not able to hold information that we are providing them. They're not able to learn new information. We all have such an important role to play when we think about providing stability and a safe space for children and connecting them to caring adults. We serve as a link to supportive services, and we can be the stability that the youth needs. And so just start thinking about for yourself and in the work that you do, what services are in your area? How do you connect youth with these services? Dr. Bruce Perry is a neurobiological scientist, researcher, and medical doctor who has done all of his work on trauma and the developing brain. So he specifically works with trauma and youth impacted by trauma. And he says that there is no more effective neurobiological intervention than a safe relationship. We all can be that intervention for the kiddo. And this is because building that relationship works to bring the brain back into regulation, back into executive functioning. Being that safe adult, being predictable, being consistent, those are interventions for youth. And this is what the trauma cycle can look like for some youth, right? And so we kind of need to understand this in the environment that we work in, where youth may display problem behaviors related to past trauma. So the youth has experienced trauma. They then have emotional, psychological damage, maybe academic challenges. This then leads to behavioral problems. This can be in the school, it can be in the courts, can be at home. Behavior patterns oftentimes can move into a punishment. We yell at the kid, we take something away from them, right? We put significant consequences on them. We suspend them from school. When we engage in that type of punishment, it actually will re-traumatize those kiddos, and it then embeds the trauma further. And it continues that cycle of behavioral problems rather than lessening the problem. So we do have some cues to when we would want to make sure that we are engaging in a trauma-sensitive lens, right? And the first cue, and for many of you, it's just knowing the history of the kid, right? Any kid in the foster care system has been impacted by trauma. Being taken out of a home is significantly traumatizing. I'm probably exaggerating, but I would say that any kid that has lived through a pandemic has been impacted by trauma. The last 2 years, the things I have observed in school buildings and in hospitals and inpatient centers for youth is something I have never experienced before. One of the hospitals that I work with in May of 2020, so when we first went into lockdown, they saw an increase of suicidal ideations by 400% for youth ages 11 to 17. 400% from the spring before. I mean, that right there shows us. Going back into this like a regular setting that we are in now this year in terms of schools and parents going back to work has also been traumatizing for kids. Right? I keep trying to tell people that the 9th graders I'm supporting, they have not had a normal school year since 6th grade. They're still stuck in like a 6th grade brain, a lot of them. Oftentimes, traditional behavioral approaches and responses will not be successful for kiddos that are impacted by trauma. Which means, and this is what, a lot of the work that I do in school districts, sometimes I think that principals and superintendents just think like Tovah must have magic fairy dust that she can just sprinkle on our students and all of the problems will go away, right? And the truth is that traditional approaches will not work, which means efforts to teach alternative behaviors are not going to show improvement in the kid's behavior. And just like somebody had mentioned earlier, sometimes what we can see is that rewards and consequences actually trigger the behavior. And for some of you might be familiar with this term, but an FBA is a functional behavior assessment. And this is something that school systems will do if they're trying to determine how to support a kid's challenging behaviors. They're not successful. Antecedent behaviors and patterns in behavior are really hard to identify. And the function of behavior may be neurological, which means it's not actually outcome driven. It's not for anything. It's because they are living in fight, flight, or freeze. I know this information, all of this information is hard to take because we all work with kids that are impacted by trauma. And that's one of the reasons why, I emphasize so much that you just being in the kiddo's life is supporting that kiddo, right? That's like layer one, the foundation. And now, what wraparound services can we provide for that kiddo too? What are some therapeutic supports we can do? What is some counseling we can do, right? What's the whole child approach for these kiddos? Because just telling them that they have bad behavior isn't going to work. So these are the components of trauma-informed care. We need to create a safe environment. We need to build relationships, build connectiveness, and support and teach emotional regulation. We can never assume that our kiddos know better. The moment that we say to ourselves, they should know better, they should be able to calm down, means that they don't. They don't know better. We have to teach them. It's our responsibility to start building up that new dendrite, that new connection in their brain. And this is how we start to move our knowledge into our practice, right? Being trauma aware means that we understand that there's trauma, right? Trauma is impacting people. When we move into being trauma responsive, it means that we begin to embed our trauma responsiveness into how we support our youth. So it's just you or you or you. It's one person that is being responsive to one kiddo or the kiddos that you serve. Ideally, and as a society, I would push, we want to move towards being trauma sensitive, which is not a quick fix. It's a multi-year transformational process where we actually embed changes into the culture, into the policies, the practices, and procedures of our organization or institution that we work in. That's the goal. Any questions up until this point? I'm going to take a drink of water. And please feel free to unmute or type in the chat. You know, when I ask you, or if you've been into my sessions before, you know, when I ask that, it means I need some water. So if we have begun in an uninformed view, and many adults have, many of us have grown up and have been raised where if we see a youth that has behavioral challenges, we think they probably have anger management problems. Right? The first year I ever taught, that's what people told me I did, that I was the anger management teacher. I can't tell you how many times administration or school staff like to diagnose a kiddo. Oh, they must have ADHD. Oh, they have oppositional defiant disorder, right? When there's no actual paperwork for that. We might also think that the child is choosing to act out, that they're uncontrollable, that they're destructive. When we start to move into a trauma-informed view, we recognize that maladaptive responses are based on the setting that the child is in. It makes them feel safer sometimes. Our children are seeking to get their needs met. Yeah, they have difficulty regulating their emotions. They're lacking some skills. They have a negative worldview. When they act out or when they are escalated, their trauma response was triggered. The trauma-informed response is that youth need to learn skills to regulate their emotions, and we as their adults provide the support for that. We have to teach them that. I'm going to take a break from talking. And I know if you won't believe me in all this information, you'll believe Oprah. Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry did a 60 minutes interview on the effects of trauma. And we're not watching all 60 minutes, but we have about a 3-4 minute clip that I'm going to be showing you of this work.
A correspondent candid with Oprah Winfrey.
Oprah, your story for 60 Minutes this week is about childhood trauma. And there's a lot of new science here about trauma-informed care. For anyone who's dealing with a traumatized child, what can they learn from your story?
Well, I think that this story is it is my hope that our story on trauma-informed care will not just be impactful, but will also be revolutionary. It certainly has caused a revolution in my own life. And I was struck by the story because it reminded me of my own childhood growing up in Milwaukee. It's not lost on me, the irony of being back in the same city, Milwaukee, where I grew up on welfare, poor, a lot of negative experiences, sexual abuse and all of that. What's the difference between a really bad childhood and being able to overcome that and a traumatic childhood and someone not being able to overcome that?
Really, it boils down to something pretty simple.
And the answer that Dr. Bruce Perry gives you is relationships.
If you also have opportunities to be connected to people in positive ways, that can buffer some of those effects. And as you get older...
I'd like to know more about that.
What he really means is love. He's a scientist, he's not going to use the word love, but it really is about how you are responded to, valued, trusted, and loved by those around you. So I didn't get it from the people who I felt I should have gotten it from. It can be anybody who cares enough about you to ask the question, what happened to you?
Could you trace back in your mind, it was that person who made the
difference? I know exactly who did it. I know exactly the moment I started to feel valued, and for me, it was school.
I wanted to be a fourth grade teacher because of Mrs. Duncan. And I haven't seen Mrs. Duncan since then, and Mrs. Duncan is here today. Mrs. Duncan!
The moment I felt the most value was in my fourth grade class when Mrs. Duncan said to me, I was the one who was chosen to lead the class and whatever it was.
So what was that like? I don't really remember. I do remember you.
I remember you were such a fluent reader.
Well,
if I had had a class full of students like Oprah, I would have been floating on air.
Mrs. Duncan instilled in me this sense of believing that I mattered. And that is what every human being is looking for.
When you first heard that I had done something in life, did you know that it was me?
Yes, I kept up with you without your being aware of it.
And it was Mrs. Duncan who helped heal you?
For me, yes. It was Mrs. Duncan, and then it was my sixth grade teacher, Mr. Graham. It was school that made me feel a sense of value and connection.
You learned a lot on this story.
Oh, I learned a lot on this story. This story was life-changing for me.
Life-changing, really?
Life-changing. And people use that word rhetorically. Life-changing. It's changed the way I operate in my business, with my people, with my school. 1, 2, 3. You say that the most important question to ask of people who have gone through trauma is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you.
Yeah.
So when you see, a church being shot up, or you see, all of the headline-making stories of people seemingly gone mad, your first thought is, what happened to that person? Right. What has been life-changing for me is the question, what happened to you? Not what is wrong with you, but what happened to you? Which is an important question, not just for people who have been so-called traumatized, but it's the most important question you can ask of anyone. I can say that of all the stories I've ever done in my life and all of the experiences I've ever had and people I've interviewed, this story has had more impact on me than practically anything I've ever done.
It's changed the way you see everyone?
It's changed the way I see everyone. So when I have an employee who is acting out of line or who is just being a jerk, I don't think, what's wrong with that guy? What's wrong with that girl? What's wrong with that person? I think, I wonder what happened to them. I wonder what happened to them. I wonder what happened that caused them to behave that way. That's what this story did for me.
All right. Yeah, if you have not gotten a chance to see that video, like I said, it's 60 minutes interview. It really is worth it. You can just go and find it on YouTube, Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey, but it is really powerful. So we're just going to take a couple minutes to start reflecting for ourselves, and then I definitely want to open it up to hear if you all have any questions or comments based on this reflection. But what's the big takeaway ideas that you want to remember when we are understanding trauma with the youth that we work with? And then are there ideas that are critical for your community, your institution to focus on as you move forward? What are things you want to bring back to your workspace? And remember, I was a teacher, so I have great wait time.
I'll have to say I really love all of the information and the idea of how we can support our youth when they are displaying challenging emotions and behaviors. And I also have to say, for me, I wish there was more of a preventive effort aimed at families working with youth, and just a partnership of, yes, of course, we want to support the youth. They are our future, but what can we do to stop what's happening at home, and how we can better support parents and families who are not as readily supported. And just, as folks who work in a professional environment who are supportive of youth, just that partnership with parents and how critical it is in breaking that chain and getting that foundational relationship at home. I would so love to see more efforts towards an entire family approach instead of just focused on the children. And I hope that doesn't come across like I really appreciate this whole PowerPoint so far in this whole presentation and webinar. I love working with youth. I feel like the families as a whole need all of this support as well. And it's sometimes easy to leave the parents get put aside, or the child gets the attention because the child is seen as what the immediate concern. I don't know. I'm really appreciating the whole webinar so far. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, and absolutely. And a big part of trauma, and when I talk about the trauma cycle, I talk about like one part of the trauma cycle, and the other part is that oppressive cycle and the trauma cycle, the generational trauma that we see with families, right? And I think that's what you're touching on, Angie. And it's one of the most, frustrating and exhausting things for myself in terms of working with school districts is the lack of support that school districts offer and provide for families, where there is actually quite a lot of community-based organizations that do provide peer support for the parents, right? That, WISE therapeutic services. And I think I saw somebody from Catholic Community Services on this training today, and they, I've worked with them a lot on the family side of it, but they're, this is one of the reasons why for all of us in here that work with youth, it's really understanding the policies, the understanding what else we can do within our organizations to support families, right? I'm working just in one school right now in Enumclaw, and through that work, we are now developing a series of parenting support groups that I'll be running for families to really understand the behaviors that they're seeing at home and what they can do to support the behaviors. But at the end of the day, right, I'm only one person. And I tend to feel comfortable running the one-woman Tovah Denaro show, but organizations and other institutions and locations that you all work at also need to start determining, what does this look like for us and for in our organization? You're totally right. And Amy, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, I had to get off of mute. I'm the manager for Child and Family Services at Multicare Behavioral Health, and I think one of the things that you pointed out about having that one person that doesn't have to be a family member that could really be that source of resilience for a child could be really instrumental in why we're seeing so many catastrophic behaviors that are happening now post-COVID or in the middle of COVID, because I think kids have been very cut off from those additional areas of support that could be there, whether that's school or sports or Girl Scouts or whatever, because people have been isolated. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah, such a good point. And I'm reading a lot of what you all are also writing in the chat. Is there anybody else that wants to unmute and talk or discuss a little bit?
I can unmute. I'm just trying to see if I can be heard amongst the playful dogs in the background here. So this is Corey Hooker. I'm actually a school counselor for a virtual school in the Bethel School District. And I find that educating our youth as well as our families is something of a benefit. Cooper. So we do have a community center that is involved also within the Bethel School District that's been helpful with identifying families and doing parent groups and so forth. There's 6-week programs, and so not necessarily do kids and families do the whole 6 weeks, which can be challenging too, because then they don't get all what they need out of it. But we're finding in our district it's a perpetual cycle that oftentimes our traumatic youth are coming from families that have a lot of trauma that is generational. So we're trying to break that and doing it at a small level in order to hopefully, impact the lives of the youth that then develop different types of I guess, adult lives, if you will. So thank you for the information. I think that this is a very hot topic and very important, and it's pretty cool to have connected professionals in other careers and backgrounds instead of just educators in this type of forum. So thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And please feel free to connect with each other and plug in email addresses in the chat. Do what you got to do to connect. And one other thing that I do think is important to note before we move on is that there are a lot of community resources that I think sometimes we don't know how to access, or especially families don't know how to access. There's a lot of, domestic violence hotlines. There's a lot of areas to get food and clothes and shelter. There's a lot of organizations that can support. And so sometimes it's also just about knowing what's in our county, what's in our community, to make sure that we are reaching out and getting the best information possible to provide for families, and then doing some follow-up, right? So, and making sure that there's follow through within the household. Us as effective adults know that we have to spend more time promoting responsible behavior than responding to irresponsible behavior, right? We also recognize that misbehavior occurs for a reason, right? And we take that reason into account when we decide how to respond, right? And so a trauma-informed support, we have safety. We provide space for youth to regulate. We're able to regulate the nervous system, which means that we have to teach self-regulation. And just putting a little adult lens on this, based on what Angie had mentioned, this also has to do with adults too. Right? Adults need a space to regulate. Sometimes adults have not learned how to self-regulate yet, and we have to teach them. Building community, right? Connecting relationships. Support the development of the coherent narrative, which means consistency. Empower youth voice. Develop and teach those social and emotional skills. And support risk-taking in a way that feels safe for kids. In your own space, to start, we have to, again, look at how do we build relationships with our youth that is not based on logistics. And I will tell you that this goes a long way with adults too, right? How do we build relationships with the adults that we support, the families that we support? If you work with youth, is your first call to the parent a bad call, a negative call? Let's reverse that, right? Let's make sure that we are getting in front of that and connecting with the families, with the adults that we support as well. Ask the youth about themselves, right? They need to see that you care in an authentic way. Teach them about their brain and their stress responses. I will tell you this funny story. One of my first years of teaching, I always taught my high schoolers about their brain development and really understanding why sometimes they escalate and did not know how to de-escalate themselves, right? So we did a lot of time talking about that and anger and emotions. And one day I had a student of mine and she came back into my classroom. She was in English. She came into my classroom. She slammed my door. She made like a big scene. So I was just like, what's going on? You know, I just kind of asked her. And of course, it had to do with a cell phone. The teacher that she was in, the English class that she was in, did not want her to have her cell phone. And the teacher pretty much got her in trouble for it, if I remember correctly. And the security came and had to take the cell phone away. And then there was a huge fight between her and the teacher, like a screaming match, right? It's pretty much like teaching 101. You don't get into power struggles with students, but there was a major power struggle in this classroom. So I was hearing her out and validating how she was feeling. And then I remember she said, but you know what? Mr. Johnson, he's right out of college. He's only 22 years old. So I think his prefrontal cortex isn't even developed yet. And like, she was essentially saying that's why he got so pissed off at her, because his prefrontal cortex wasn't developed yet. And it took like all of my power. I was just like, and in my head, I was like, oh my gosh, they're using the information against us. But it's important. Like, we need them to understand how the brain works and how it functions. We need to know their triggers, right? Again, this goes back to relationship. And providing choices is so powerful. This actually calms down their limbic system because you're giving them the opportunity to use their own voice for their agency, for their own power. I said this earlier, but having predictable and safe environments is trauma informed. It is an intervention. We want to make sure that we have space for youth to calm themselves if we work in a setting where we need that, so that they can physically remove themselves to regroup. We need expectations around this. We need all adults that are supporting youth to be on the same page. We don't want any youth to be surprised by a decision. And, you know, this is important to consider with youth impacted by the court system. Oftentimes, youth in the court system have multiple adults that are speaking for them, right? They'll have a social worker, you know, they have a judge in front of them. They might have a lawyer, a guardian ad litem or an advocate. They might have different parents or different family members that aren't on the same page. And so in that circumstance, I would say that for you as that safe advocate for your kiddo, to talk to them about it beforehand so there's no surprises. We're not going to move through this reflection right now, but it's something for you to think about. When do you notice that youth you work with seem to have the most behavioral challenges? Times of day, certain activities. I put down here, but you know it's true. Certain people sometimes, certain adults. So again, we need to really focus on prevention, right? And I know that prevention starts long before we have the kids in our space, but starting once that kiddo enters our space, how can we develop the structure and predictability to support them? We need our students or our youth to know what the expectations are. We need to be clear about that. And this is so they don't have to code switch from adult to adult in the same space. Every person needs to be on the same page. We want to have structure and we want to avoid deviating from it. Unpredictability causes a lot of chaos inside many, many kids. Sensory materials is really powerful for kiddos. Most of the school counseling centers that I go into or therapeutic mental health centers that I go into, they have some type of sensory stuff for kids, right? A rubber squeeze ball, maybe stuffed animals, but something else so kids can hold on and have something to engage in when they're maybe going through some tough stuff. I always urge you to make sure that none of your sensory items have glass in it, because I've seen a couple really cool mugs get smashed to smithereens. And I would say that's the adult's fault for having a cup as a sensory material. And then as a reminder, the only thing we have control over is our environment and our behavior. We cannot control our kids' behavior, which is why we need preventative accommodations in order to respond to the student behavior in a way that's going to impact and support them. We want to design an environment that elicits appropriate behavior. And this includes furniture, arrangement of furniture. And we often don't really think about this. What does supervision look like? Where are the adult areas? Where are student areas or youth areas? Do youth know that? If you have youth that are seated, do you have to consider specific seating arrangements? This is a really important strategy because we want to set up a physical environment that allows us as adults to safely monitor our youth and the activities that they engage in so that they have feelings of safety and predictability. And we also need to consider traffic patterns, literally in the space that we are working in. And I'm going to show you some examples. And most of these are from classrooms, which I understand that not all of you, not many of you work in school settings, but I'm hoping it'll give you an idea. This visual on the left comes from a classroom where a student significantly escalated really badly and destroyed most of the posters on the wall, threw the pencils. It was a pretty big escalation. Where do you, based on this visual, this image I have for you, where would you guess that the student was located when that happened?
Under the flag.
Yes. The kiddo was backed up against the wall, and the teacher was essentially having a pretty difficult conversation with the kid, right? There was no place for him to go. He felt triggered. He had a trauma response, and his response was that fight, essentially, right? And so he started really tearing everything off the walls. Okay, so these are the little things that sometimes we have to think about. We do not ever want to put ourselves in between the exit and where the youth is. Now, I would say the only disclaimer about that is if you have a youth who has some developmental delays, a youth in special education who's young, who is a runner, you probably would want to put yourself between them and the exit so that they don't run from you, or make sure it's hard to have them access the exit. All right, the picture on the right-hand side is, it shows you an example of like a smooth transition for the kids, right? Lots of space around the desk. They're able to easily get up. There's different chair options for students as well. These are examples of some chill areas for kiddos, right? Something a little bit quieter, a little calmer, some soft stuff for them. Again, this would be an example if you need a space for kids to regulate themselves, to use some coping skills. Other examples of what that could look like. I love the beanbags in this visual, right? The different options for seats and for seating arrangements for kids. Again, this would be something that would need, it's very creative, which I do like, and it also might lead to some challenges in terms of where kids would want to sit. So that's something where expectations would have to be made ahead of time. Right, again, these are just nice, calm areas. On the left-hand side, some space, and then on the right-hand side, a lot of space for kiddos to walk around each other, to move. Obviously, we know that with COVID, where we and youth are located might look a little bit different. And the one thing I would say about that is if you have youth who have a hard time understanding abstract ideas, such as you have to be 6 feet away from me, and what the heck does 6 feet look like? Make sure that you have that visual, right? So make sure that you have the visual so the kiddo knows where they need to be. And then if you do work with families, or if you support families, making sure that you help families create space for their kiddos to take breaks, for their kiddos to learn. Right? It can be very chaotic for kids when they get home in terms of where they can do their work, where they can calm down, where they can have space for themselves. And so talking with your youth about that can be helpful, and then addressing it with the family. We also want to make sure that we create adult routines and youth routines. And they might look different, right? Our routines might look different than the youth that we work with. Clear organization of these routines is going to be powerful. We want to create a positive physical space, arrange some type of schedule. Maybe you're only with a kiddo for an hour or two, maybe longer than that. But what does that schedule look like? If you work with multiple youth in one setting, using a consistent attention signal, right? This could be a clapping, some type of auditory signal, some type of visual. Some people, it's like the hands up, but something to make sure that you're able to get all of their attention back. Managing their independence. We want to teach them independence. That's part of executive functioning. And this strategy is important because we want our youth to know what to do. We don't want there to be surprises. This reduces their own stress, and it increases the likelihood that we can prompt and cue for a quick behavior change if we know what the routine is, if we know what the procedures are. For routines and procedures, we want to add them to places in the day where youth are having difficulty meeting expectations, where they're displaying challenging behavior. We need to teach the behavior we want in order to reduce the behavior that we don't want. And we want to reinforce youth for following the appropriate behavior. And so if any of you are advocates for youth who may experience challenging behaviors, this would be really important to talk about with the school team, with the wraparound team. Unpredictability can be really challenging for kids. We have to make sure that all of the steps are taught explicitly, that it's do statements instead of don't do. Like use walking feet, for example, instead of don't run, and that we're consistent with it. Thinking about for your own work, where can you maximize structure and predictability? Where can you plan out routines? When you have well-organized routines and procedures, you model and you prompt organized behavior. When I go into a space that is really chaotic, it makes sense to me why the youth are having challenging behaviors. The more that we can model organization, the more they're going to be able to copy that. And sometimes we need different routines just to support the flow of the space and provide information in nonverbal ways. How many of you get frustrated when you go into a restaurant and you can't find where the heck the bathroom is, right? I need signage. I don't want to have to ask every server I come into contact with. Signage is important for adults. It's important for youth. Visuals. Here are some other examples. Some making sure that we have our routine down with the kiddo, that we're consistent with that routine. I did mentor work for many years in a school district, and every youth that I met with, I had the same schedule. We did the same thing every single week. We always started with a puzzle, right? To kind of like loosen it up a bit, get a little comfortable. And then we moved into the work that we were expected to do. And by the way, I hate puzzles, so that was all for the kids. Nowadays, if you engage virtually with kids, there's so many options online for what this could look like virtually. Even different greetings for social distancing. What is appropriate? What can we do?
Well, I don't know where they would be. There, you might closet in the guest room.
Okay. And then another way is for an emotional check-in. Right, we want to make sure we are checking in with where our kids are at. And the thing that's important for the emotional check-in is that we don't only want to do this when we think the kid's in a bad mood, right? That might in and of itself trigger them. We want to do this on a daily, it's just part of our routine. And having a visual can be really helpful. And I have more examples. Asking for help. How do your youth know how to ask for help? What does that look like in your space? Who do they go to? Right, there's different ways to do this. Here are some examples. Some other examples, self-assessments can be helpful, especially for older kiddos. And just as a reminder, and can everybody make sure that they're muted?
Great.
All right, so youth may get frustrated if they don't know how and when to contact you. So if you are not a person that is in your youth's life every single day, this can be an area of frustration for them. And it might lead to them being discouraged. And so then they don't actually ever want to contact you because they don't know how. So ways that we can get through this and ways that we can support our youth and families for this is to establish set hours, whether you want to call them office hours or whatever. But you want to communicate your information and set the hours so that the youth know in advance when you will be available for them and when you're going to be gone. And if, if it's going to be more than 24 hours, you want to make sure that they know that you're not going to contact them. For youth that I support and youth that I work with in the foster care system, I have pretty strict boundaries with cell phones, with phone use. And so making sure that, at 4 o'clock on Friday, I do not pick up my phone if it's a youth I support until Monday at 8 a.m. And my youth know that. Provide directions often and provide directions in various ways. So you want to be really clear and concise and make sure it's visual and written and auditory. And make sure that you're providing feedback that is timely for them. if there's issues or concerns or something that needs to be adjusted or goal setting. Youth need to be aware of their progress and their lack of progress so that you can all do something about it. Schedules make the environment predictable. This would be an example of how I support families when I do family work within school districts, is I help families determine a schedule for their kiddo, make it predictable, put it up. This can be done not only in a school setting, but wherever youth are engaged in supports. And we do want to plan for a variety of formats. And there is something called the PREMAC principle, which is if you have to request a youth to do something that kind of sucks, right? An undesirable activity, you want to follow that activity with something that's more desirable, right? It's kind of like if you eat your vegetables, you get ice cream for dessert. It's that same principle, which is why it's called Grandma's rule, actually. And then we want to always make sure that we are maintaining this schedule. The reason why it's so important to maintain consistency with schedules is it sends the message to our kiddos that we value every single moment we spend with them. I work with kids where the first many meetings I have with them, they might not talk to me for the entire hour I'm with them. That doesn't mean that I stop trying. It doesn't mean that I leave at 45 minutes. I stay with them during that time to show them that that is their time. I am there for them in that moment, whether or not they really need me in that moment or whether or not they trust me in that moment, right? It's about building that relationship through consistency. So again, this is going to be an opportunity for you later to start thinking about how you would incorporate some of these strategies. And then we move into expectations. So it is really important for us to be able to review and talk about expectations with our kiddos. Expectations look differently if you're in the courtroom than they do if you're at home. They look differently at school than they do when you're out in the community with your friends. So you have to talk about this with them, get them to understand that code switching. I'm not going to go over all this, but you have access to it. And youth impacted by trauma thrive from established expectations. We develop high expectations for them. We want them to know that we see them as worthy of feeling safe and respected. Consistency with expectations helps to differentiate purposeful rules from unpredictable rules. And it helps us as adults to be on the same page. And you can do this by even constructing a behavior matrix. Right? So if we have a problem behavior like criticizing and discounting each other, how would we state that positively for our kids? Using kind words, using kind actions. If we have a problem with not listening to adults, we want to positively state that with following directions. And this is what these can look like, right? We have our values or our expectations. And then what does this look like on the student end, the youth end? What does this look like on the adult end? And we want to make sure that any abstract concepts, and the two biggest ones are time and noise, are concrete. They need a visual. What does 20 minutes actually mean? What does the noise level 2 mean? That might look different based on the community and where they are. So we have to explain this to them. Use of cell phones, right? What does this look like in different settings? Here are some other examples that you will have access to for how to teach rules, what rules can look like, and just recognizing that it's an ongoing process. We will repeatedly have to reinforce kiddos teach the expectations, model the expectations, and acknowledge them. And involving the youth in what these expectations look like. Don't just tell them what they are, but ask them for their input. And then lastly, we have positive acknowledgements. Positive acknowledgement or praise is a really powerful tool for youth to help build their self-esteem. And this means that we focus our attention on the desired behavior, which increases the repetition of the kid engaging in the behavior. It builds positive communication, positive climate, and it increases the time that we can spend engaging with them in a purposeful way. There has been a lot of research done on positive to corrective behaviors. And so what it shows is that we want to reinforce positive behavior at about a 5-to-1 ratio of corrective. For youth who experience trauma, the ratio needs to be higher to increase the predictability of the acknowledgement. They need to know it's coming if they do something good. Right? Some people also talk about this in terms of like, how full is your bucket? This is a great book for younger kids if you work with younger kids. But we want our kids to feel seen, to feel validated. Some people do this in a way where like we take pictures and we hang them, where you give tickets. But ask your kiddos as well, what would they want as a reinforcement? How would they earn these different reinforcements? And keep it simple for yourself. There's different ways to connect reinforcement based on what they want. Do they want social time, some activities, sensory issues, like sensory stuff, token economy, tangibles, right? So we want and need student and youth buy-in. And by the way, this works for adults too. So I'm going to just reiterate, it starts with positive relationships, youth and adults. It has to start with a positive relationship. Here's some more examples for you and some different strategies you can try. And a final reflection for all of you. And we are on questions. Are there any questions before we wrap up? All right, I am going to leave this here for you so you know you will have access to this. I am always willing and able to take any questions that come up, so feel free to email me. And I also do these webinars monthly. So next month in January, I'm doing it on de-escalation. So really getting into the nitty-gritty of how do we support students to regulate? How do we support with de-escalation? And before you leave, I am going to plug in the slides for you, as well as a certificate. So feel free to print out that certificate. It shows how many hours you're with me, if you can get credit or money from your work. All right, is that it? Yes. Okay. And Ron wrote, as a retired public school teacher in Tacoma, now a child advocate for children in foster care, all of these strategies for teachers, for teachers and classrooms are very useful for what I'm doing now. I would urge other advocates to be in contact. Definitely, I totally agree with you, Ron. All right, I just plugged in the slides. Sorry, I'm multitasking. And now I will plug in the certificate. And I see It looks like there might be some hands raised, so please feel free to unmute yourself while I am plugging this in.
Hi, Tovah. This is Barbie Dagenhart with Beacon Health Options. And I just had a quick question about like the token reinforcement that you were speaking about towards the end. And how do you avoid like shame and, you know, traumatization with kiddos that are, you know, looking kind of and trying to avoid like, you know, negative reinforcement and that kind of a thing?
So the first thing is that I do not call out bad behavior. I'm putting quotation marks on that. And so whenever I engage, and I'm a big advocate for tangible reinforcements in the environment that you work in. And I am doing it like at first, I really do it kind of like I'm giving out candy. Like anytime I see an expected behavior, I am providing that tangible reinforcement. I am not acknowledging the inappropriate behavior unless I have to do it right privately and it's just one-on-one. I provide multiple opportunities throughout the session that I'm with, if I'm with like multiple students or multiple youth, let's say, where every child will have the opportunity to get something, to get that sticker or to get the tangible item, even if that means that for, you know, 5 seconds, I catch them sitting quietly. And then I'm going to reinforce that, because what we'll see is that it starts to become like we start to see an increase in that behavior. But I avoid calling out or shaming. I'm the worst thing I think that any teacher or however you work with youth can do is having like a clip chart where kids are being clipped up and down the chart all day long. So if you see that in a school building, or if you see that in a space that supports youth, you can tell them that Tovah says that that is a no. That is extremely not trauma informed or trauma responsive, because we don't want to call out kids for doing the bad behavior or the negative behavior. Did that answer your question?
It does. Yeah. And I was just kind of, I guess, I think it does, because you answered, you know, that you're giving out something tangible for every, you know, like tiny little thing that they can do that is positive. I was just, you know, trying to avoid, you know, like they're seeing other kiddos getting something and maybe they're not behaving, you know, in the you know, in a way that you're hoping that they would.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was just hoping to avoid them feeling shame for not getting, you know, the positive reinforcement.
Yeah. So the other thing that I would do, Barbie, so a couple things. I always have multiple different ways of getting the reinforcement. So I might do a whole group reinforcement. So if every kid is in my office at 5 p.m. when they're supposed to be, then they're all getting that reinforcement, right? And then I'll do the individual reinforcements as well. And I think where I see it go wrong in settings is when we are waiting for the kid to engage in the appropriate behavior, what we want them to see. And they're messing around and they're having a hard time. And then the second that they engage in the appropriate behavior, we miss that opportunity to acknowledge them. And when I talk to adults about it, like, oh, the kid did do that though. Typically the adult is like, well, I wanted to see it last longer, or that kid already had his hand raised for 30 seconds. So I had to call on him. But when you have the kid whose behavior is much more intense than the other kids, you do want to call them out and differentiate how much attention that we are providing them. So it will be more attention that we are providing them in the beginning of building that relationship.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you all so much for attending today. And again, be on the lookout on my Instagram or on my website for the information for January's session, which is on de-escalation strategies. Thank you. It was nice meeting all of you. Bye.